All right, so we've got bacteria now interacting with the environment with this nitrogen cycle, cycling through nitrogen. But bacteria interact with the environment and with us in lots of different ways. The nitrogen cycle was not, I am assuming, well known by you before you came in here. But because of all of our interest in, say, the way the Earth is working at the moment, we have a vital interest in what's known as the carbon cycle. This is the sum total of all the reactions on Earth between compounds that contain carbon, releasing carbon dioxide and absorbing carbon dioxide. Typically, we think of this in terms of plants and animals, right? You guys have this idea with the carbon cycle that plants produce oxygen by taking in carbon dioxide, and we produce carbon dioxide and take in oxygen. It's a relationship. Bacteria, though, are, in my opinion, they are really far more important than even plants and animals. Bacteria and archaeans produce and consume gigantic amounts of carbon. Huge amounts of carbon. Heck, phytoplankton are primarily prokaryotic. They make about 50% of the oxygen in the world. Bacteria are going to consume and produce a lot of methane. Methane's a serious greenhouse gas. Have you guys heard of greenhouse gases before? Making sure. I did have one student ask me in a previous semester, why do we keep building greenhouses if greenhouse gases are so bad? I couldn't tell if she was kidding. Methane is a super potent greenhouse gas. Much, much, much more so than carbon is, or carbon dioxide is. What ends up happening with greenhouse gases is the energy from the sun comes in as light, and it strikes the Earth. That heats up the Earth a little bit, but a lot of that can be reflected out, released by the atmosphere. The problem is the radiant energy that's being, the radiant heat energy that's being released is not as efficiently released as it is coming in. So you're building up more of it. It's forming a feedback loop. We need to reflect more of this energy, and we're just not able to. Carbon stores some of that heat. Carbon dioxide stores some of that heat energy. But methane stores much, much, much more of it. To the point where in the ancient Earth past, we had a lot of methane in our atmosphere. Once carbon was produced instead of methane, the temperature dropped dramatically and froze the Earth. So this methane that's produced and consumed by bacteria can actually produce enormous changes in the atmosphere. A methanogen is an organism that converts carbon to methane. So they're usually anaerobic. They live in places where you don't get much oxygen. Typically, I tend to think of them as living in swamps, deep sea areas, in the gut of organisms. If you've ever been to a swamp, heck, if you're ever walking in trails over top of water and you see bubbles coming up, people always look at those bubbles and they think there might be a turtle down there. It's not. It's methane being released. Because at the bottom of that pond or whatever, you've got a lot of sediments that are decaying, and there's no oxygen in there. So the gases that are produced are methane. They just build up in these pockets. And then as you step down on a bridge or whatever you're stepping on, it disturbs the sediment, that pocket's released, and you get gases. It's what leads to the smell around these sort of stagnant swamps. Bog of eternal stench, right? The gut of other organisms. You'll notice that all sorts of organisms are flatulent, and it's usually not because that organism is producing gas. It's because the bacteria inside of them are. It's just like the smell of your armpit is not you. The smell of your armpit is the bacteria in your armpit. So these things are being produced. They're producing all of these foul-smelling methanes. Marsh gas produced in wetlands is produced by methane pockets. If the sediment's disturbed, the methane's released. This leads to a lot of old stories about will-o-wisps and ghosts and aliens. Because what happens is, if you're by an area of water and that water releases methane, as the moon's light shines through it, it's distorted and it starts to look green. People have chased these into the swamps, thinking they saw a lantern or whatever. So they go into a swamp and they get lost because as you get closer, the moon's, the light's not at the same angle from the moon anymore, and it just disappears. But they might see something farther in, so they go even farther in. People would get lost at night because of this. So the deal is, we've got these bacteria building up methane. Well, wherever you have any substrate, you're going to have something that breaks that substrate down. So where you have methanogens, in the same environment, you usually have METHANOTROPHS. METHANOTROPHs, trophic, so they eat. They eat methane. They take methane and they break it down, usually into carbon dioxide. So you get a balance. The methanogens build methane, the METHANOTROPHs eat it. And as long as everything stays in balance, the climate's fine. It's where that balance is lost that you end up getting a buildup of greenhouse gases or a loss of greenhouse gases, either of which can be dangerous. I do want to make you guys aware of that. Right now, our current climate, we have probably too many greenhouse gases. But there have been times in the Earth's history where we had too few, and everything died then too. And I say too because everything's just getting ready to die now anyway. Though there's this delicate balance, and bacteria tend to live in balances. They live in a state of what's known as symbiosis, oftentimes with whatever other organisms around. Here we got a clownfish and an anemone living in what's known as symbiosis. The anemone provides protection, the clownfish provides cleaning services. Bacteria live in you in the same way. Bacteria might live in what's known as a mutualistic relationship. This is a type of symbiosis in which both organisms have a mutual benefit. Obviously, the larva here didn't do well. The mutual benefit's actually between the bacteria and these little worm parasites. Because what happens here is these worms infect a larva. The larva, eats the eggs that were in some bird feces or something. The worms hatch inside the larva, and the worms all have a bacteria inside them that's red. So what happens is, as the worms grow inside the larva starts to turn red, which means it's much more visible to birds. So the bird comes down and eats the larva. Now inside the bird are these worms that lay their eggs that go out through the bird's feces to infect more larvae. So it's a mutual relationship. The worms provide a location and food for the bacteria to grow. The bacteria provide a beacon to help the worms continue their life cycle. And you have parasitism. Parasitism is when one organism benefits at the expense of another. And that's what you may think of when you typically think of bacterial infections. Most bacterial infections you get are not beneficial to you, except when you get to stay home from school. Then I guess it's mutualistic. Most bacteria inside of us live in a mutualistic manner. Inside of you, right now, there are 10 to 100 trillion microbes hanging out. Typically, they live in your colon. So the end of your digestive system. That's probably not surprising to you, and also a lot of reasons why you have to wash your hands after you come out of the bathroom. And I'm sorry, I'm the one that has to tell you that. These bacteria at the end of your digestive system, you guys, what's your digestive system for? You guys know? Yeah, breaking down food, getting nutrients from your food, right? So you've got these intestines that loop back and forth, giving this long surface area to draw out nutrients. Thing is, though, we can't process all the food we eat. So at the very end of your digestive system, you've got bacteria. And those bacteria do a great job of breaking down the food that you can't break down. They break it down very efficiently. They get some energy from that, and then once they've broken it down a little, they pass the broken down piece to you that you can further break down. They're like good bacteria. So you don't have to expend any energy to break the food down, and the bacteria get some food from that. The bacteria thrive on the byproducts of those chemical reactions. And in turn, truthfully, they end up producing a lot of byproducts too. A lot of the gases that get produced at the end of your digestive system are produced by the bacteria. When you eat something, and you guys know your own digestive habits, when you eat something that your body has a hard time breaking down, you'll notice that you're going to be a little bit more flatulent. Why? Because the bacteria at the end are working extra hard. They're getting a lot of energy from it, but they're also producing a lot of waste gases. And those gases have to go somewhere. And it's way easier to come out the end side than the front side. Does that make sense? We do have to deal with a lot of pathogens, though. We have to deal with a lot of organisms that are parasitic. Pathogens will attack every type of organism out there. If it's alive, it has a pathogen. There is nothing that we know of, no organism out there that does not have another organism that preys on it in some way. Whether with us, with I don't know, necrotizing fasciitis or some sort of bacterial infection, staph infections, or bacteria getting infected by another bacteriophage, or even plants getting tumors. You don't think of cancer in plants, but they get it. Everything has a pathogen. A common bacterial attack mechanism, because bacteria tend to invade other cells, is they're going to trick a cell into taking it in. They're going to trick a cell into absorbing the bacteria. They do that by inserting DNA into the other cell or getting it to absorb it. And then that lets them take over that other cell. Once a bacteria is inside another cell, everything changes. We talked about chlamydia being an obligate intracellular pathogen. We've got to get from being a free-living bacteria into the other cell. So if you were to trick the other cell by giving it DNA, that DNA sent a message, and the message was, absorb the thing next to you. It does. Once that bacterial cell gets absorbed, it begins to act like a foreign organelle. That is, it produces messages, and it starts to send directives to the rest of the cell. The directive is usually, bring me all the food. If there's something nutritious, give it to me. And that lets the bacteria grow and reproduce within the cell. Eventually, the cell dies. But the bacteria, or now multiple bacteria, can then burst forth and go and invade other cells. You've heard of common pathogens like E. coli. It lives naturally in your gut. But if it gets to the wrong place, it could cause you harm. You may have heard of pneumonia. Pneumonia will cause bacteria to grow in your lungs, and those bacteria secrete, not surprising, more glycocalyx. That glycocalyx then fills the, and other fluids, I'm sorry, will fill the lungs, causing you not to be able to take any air in. Pseudomonas is actually what you would probably have had as a pneumonia. Pneumonia is fills your lungs, but acute pneumonia leads to lung inflammation. Here you can see your normal lung with all these nice open areas for air. Here you see a similar tissue with everything filled with the bacteria. That means that air doesn't get into the lungs and you suffocate. Bacteria are in a constant fight with one another. And you know, sometimes the Pseudomonas and stuff like that growing inside of you. In your gut, you've got bacteria that are good, and you've got bacteria that might not be as good. And they're fighting with each other. The way they fight each other is by sending out chemicals to turn off protein production in other cells. Literally, these bacteria are geared to fight each other more than they're geared to fight us. If you can stop another bacteria from getting a foothold, then that other bacteria will die off, or at least you'll out-reproduce it. So they make these chemicals that stop other bacteria from being able to reproduce. They stop other bacteria from being able to take in food, and thus it kills them. And this is where we get smart. We can't figure out how to beat bacteria, but bacteria can figure out how to beat bacteria. So we just said, all right, fine. We're going to make copies of that chemical that stops the other bacteria. And that's where we get our antibiotics. We farm bacteria to get the weapons they use against each other. And that lets us stop with an antibiotic. It specifically targets bacteria, because that's what the bacteria we're targeting, and it doesn't hurt our cells. So we win. We've discovered antibiotics that can wipe out these bacteria, except, oh wait, bacteria are still evolving and thus leading to antibiotic resistance. But don't worry, if we keep looking at the bacteria, if we keep research going into bacterial arms races, we can find the new antibiotics, the antibiotics that bacteria are using against each other, and then start to use those for our own purposes. That's one big thing that we use bacteria for. We use bacteria for all sorts of cool stuff. We used to have to, if anybody is diabetic, you have to use a syringe and inject yourself with insulin to control your sugar levels. We used to have to get that from pigs. Literally, we would take pig's blood, spin it in the centrifuge really fast, extract the insulin. We don't do that anymore. We got it on tap. Bacteria are producing insulin for us. We've genetically engineered them. We've genetically engineered bacteria to clean up oil spills. We go out, we spray bacteria on top of the oil. The bacteria break the oil down. Once the bacteria have broken the oil down, I don't know what happens to them. We've dumped tons of bacteria into the oceans because they eat bacteria. And nobody thought, what happens when they're done? We'll find out. Eventually.